Flour 101. Want to bake like a pro? Let's break down the three most common flours: self-rising, all-purpose, and bread flour, and when to use each one properly. Bread is high on everybody's to-do list, so let's take some of the scary out of it and let's make it a simple process. And at first it is a little intimidating, but with a little practice and a few mistakes, the art of baking bread can become second nature without any worries or fear. If you've read anything about bread, you've come across the term leavening. Leavening is just simply rise or lift. And there are many ingredients that act as leavening agents. Leavening agents react with ingredients and form carbon dioxide gas. That carbon dioxide gas creates air bubbles and forms air pockets and giving dough its texture and airiness. There are many types of flour, and I'm going to only talk about the three main types that I use, and that is all-purpose flour, self-rising flour, and bread flour. And I try to keep all three in my pantry at all times. A few of those leavening agents can include baking powder, baking soda, salt, butter or fat, milk or any liquid that is used, and sugar, and a whole bunch of others. Those things are leavening agents, and mixed with the ingredients in your dough is going to create that particular rise that you need. They can be chemical agents, they can be organic agents, and they can be mechanical agents. The chemical agents are those that are considered man-made, and that is like our baking soda, our baking powders, anything that is man-made, that would be considered the chemical agent. Examples of the organic agents would be like your yeast and starters. Those are organic agents. And then there's mechanical agents, and that is the fluffing of ingredients, that is beating, whipping, creaming, and foaming of those ingredients. As a standard rule, each type of flour is milled to have a specific percentage of protein, which creates gluten. The gluten is what gives the rise. Gluten is formed by linking the proteins together. This action develops the dough's elasticity and stretch, and it creates tenderness in the dough. Each bag of flour will tell you somewhere written on that bag what the protein percentage is, and that percentage determines that flour's strength. Self-rising will be about 8.5% protein. You're going to use self-rising to make cakes. You can use self-rising for biscuits, for cobblers, anything that you want a good rise. You're going to probably reach for self-rising flour, or the recipe is going to probably call for self-rising flour most of the time. Now, what makes it self-rising is the fact that it already has included in the flour your baking powder and your salt. Those are the leavening agents that give rise to that flour, which will be the dough when you start working with it. All-purpose flour, that is just all-purpose, and it is the same basically as plain flour. Sometimes a recipe will say all-purpose, and sometimes it'll just say plain. But all-purpose is what you're going to use, and you will add the leavening agents into that if the recipe calls for it. All-purpose flour works really well for pie shells because you're not going to want a terrific rise on your pie shells. Anything in cookies, like chocolate chip cookies, the thinner items, you're not going to want a giant rise, and so it's best to turn to the all-purpose flour for that. Now, you can, in a pinch, if you only have all-purpose, you can turn your all-purpose flour into self-rising flour. Let's say you just have all-purpose, but you want to make a recipe and it calls for self-rising. You can add the leavening agents to make that a self-rising flour. In order to easily convert your all-purpose flour into self-rising flour, for each cup of flour, you will add 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder and 1/4 teaspoon of salt. That's for each cup of flour. So if your recipe calls for 3 cups of flour, you're going to triple the baking soda and the salt by that measurement. So let me make the math easy for myself. Let's say your recipe calls for 2 cups of flour. You will use 3 teaspoons, because it's 1.5 per cup, 3 teaspoons of baking powder and 1/2 teaspoon of salt. And you mix that in, incorporate it really, really good. Not just throw it in and swish it. You want it really incorporated good so that that powder and salt is spread throughout the flour. Then you have self-rising flour. All-purpose flour is generally 11.7% protein, and all-purpose flour is not self-rising. Bread flour is 12.7% protein. This is a good choice when you're making breads of any kind. Whether it's yeast breads, sandwich breads, and loaf breads are best made with bread flour. And bread flour is not self-rising. You have to add your leavening agents. And in most cases, there's going to be some yeast involved. And while learning about flour, it's important to understand how to measure flour. You just have greater results if you measure properly, and that does not include digging down with a measuring cup and dumping it in, because what you're doing is you're compacting your flour, which will result in having an excess amount of flour in your dough recipe, and it doesn't call for it. That can make your dough, which your bread or whatever you're baking, be too dense, really. I mean, I've done it. It makes it too dense and makes it a very heavy loaf. So if something calls for 2 cups of flour, the best way to measure is have 2 measuring devices, or a dipping device and a measuring cup. You fluff that flour, you dip that flour out, and you put it in your measuring cup, and then you level it off with a spatula, a knife blade, or something. But you don't have your measurement rounded over and it's not compacted. That is a more precise measurement. An even more precise measurement of flour is by weighing it. When you're using the measuring cup, that is measured by volume, but when you are using it by weight, and a lot of recipes will have so many grams of flour, then that is weight and needs to be weighed on scales. If you have kitchen scales, you will be more precise in making your baked goods if you weigh them, because you can take so many grams of flour and compare that to so many cups of flour, and they're not gonna equal the same. You're closer and more precise if you can weigh them. If you can't, then it is close enough as long as you measure properly and you're not compacting that flour, because it makes a big difference. Even if you only have 2 extra teaspoons of flour, it can make that dough more dense and a lot heavier and a lot more tougher to chew, the finished product. And when it comes to kneading dough, if a recipe calls for it, it's important to do it. It does not have to be complicated, but it can be an art form once you learn how to do it. And it is important to knead the dough, because that helps to form the gluten, which in turn helps to form the structure of the dough. It will create a smooth, elastic dough with a good rise. There are some exceptions where you don't have to knead dough, and that's when you're making drop biscuits or when you're making focaccia. Focaccia gets folded rather than having to knead that dough. Focaccia dough needs to rest to rise and then be folded again, rest again to rise, and fold it again multiple times. This is called proofing, when you are allowing dough to rest. When it's resting, all that chemistry stuff goes on inside of the dough and it starts working the magic. So it is important to proof most dough. And proofing can happen in a microwave if you've got a warm microwave. A lot of stoves nowadays have a proofing setting on the stove. My dehydrator even has a proofing setting. So there's lots of ways, but most of the time proofing will take place perfectly fine if the bowl is covered, the dough is in a warm place to just sit for however long that recipe calls for. So I have gotten the flour out of my container, and I'm going to pour it in here and fluff it around. I need just a little bit more. so it's fluffed, it's not packed in there. And then I'm just going to use a knife and I'm going to cut this down with the blade, and I'm going to scrape off the excess. A level measurement is the proper way to measure flour.